Let's talk about some of the creative parts of Aetaltis first. With Aetaltis, it is a classic fantasy genre, elves, orcs, dwarves, that
Yeah.
kind of thing, right? Okay, so what were you trying to accomplish when you were bringing out Aetaltis?
Yeah. So the thing about it is that I don't think that people dislike those classic fantasy ideas and elements. I mean, the reality is that those classic concepts are what made fantasy gaming so popular. It's what built what we're doing today. And there's a lot there that really strikes a chord with people. In fact, people talk about tropes. I don't think people hate tropes. People hate tropes done badly. They hate it when people use a trope like a crutch, as opposed to really understanding what it is about a trope that strikes a chord with us. And so what we wanted to do was say, look, it's a new world. I love the old gaming settings. I love the Forgotten Realms, the Greyhawk, all of those old worlds that we've all played. But there should be more worlds for us to explore with that same sort of concept and feel, except reimagined for today's world and today's games and today's gamers, right? And so I don't think that there's a lack of that. There's just a lack of it being done really well. And so that was our focus. We went into this to say, how can we really make this work and capture what made this such a popular thing?
Well, I think that is an interesting way to approach it, because I can think about that in a lot of different genres, not only RPGs, but movies or TV or things like that. That I don't not like the classics. I mean,
Mhm.
they're classics for a reason.
Yeah.
So, how have you reimagined them?
Well, some of the things that we've taken a look at is taking a look at things like even simple things. I mean, broke it down to the lowest level of saying, like, well, how do people think of dwarves? Generally, when you talk about dwarves, like, oh, they're stubborn and hardworking and all this. But we started to say, well, why is that? And how do we split that apart? Because one of the things we didn't like was that culture and race, we call it lineage, got conflated into a single thing, which isn't how the universe works. So we split those pieces apart and we looked at what in the culture created those behaviors. So when you sit down to play that character, you've got a rich backstory with the dwarves. For example, they were driven out of their homes when the gods used the Deeplands as a prison for the dark creatures. And the dwarves are furious about this. They've decided they can't count on anyone. If you can't count on the gods, who can you count on? And they've decided the only people you can count on is one another. So they're stubborn. They want to do it themselves. They know how it should be done and they're going to do it right. They're going to prove that they can do it no matter how impossible the task seems. And so all of a sudden you've got this classic dwarf, but you've got this rich story built around it that takes all of those core ideas and gives them meaning and purpose and a place in our world that sort of makes sense of it all. And so that's just an example of a very sort of tropey thing, but how we sort of looked at it and how we rebuilt it from the ground up.
The division between a species and a lineage. I mean, we
Yeah.
have the word race, which is a classic and has a very specific meaning within the fantasy genre. So I
Yeah.
mean, like, personally, I don't mind having that, because most of the time when you're talking about race within the context of a fantasy story, you're talking about some kind of species.
Hmm.
But that does, even if you go that route, that does leave out this idea of culture.
Hmm.
And often those are not separated in fantasy RPGs, but the way you could potentially overlay them is very interesting. And so that's what
Yeah.
you're working on in Aetaltis.
Well, that's exactly what we've done, is where you choose your lineage, which represents the physical package of abilities that come with your character, not necessarily your personality, not necessarily what you like or dislike or who you hate or love, but just what you are. And then you choose your culture, which represents how you were raised, what the values were of those people, who they liked, who they didn't like, who they were fearful of, what were their goals and the things that they wanted out of the world. And what's fun about this is you start getting into things where maybe you have a dwarf raised by elves. And how does that change who the character is? Or maybe you have an orog, which are these huge, like ogreish creatures. Maybe it was raised by the Chibot, which are the Warreners are a culture of merchants. And so all of a sudden, what happens when these small people who are merchants suddenly adopt this orog and raise him that way? What sort of a character do you end up with? So although you can still play the character sort of straight, it gives you lots of opportunities to really mix and match. And it also just sets the groundwork for who you are. It doesn't say who you have to be. It lets you know whether or not you diverge from the normal in the world. So when you read the dwarf, say the Maladoran culture, you might say, yeah, I don't want to play that guy, and say, perfect. So you're the person who stands out in your society as the one who doesn't follow the rules that everyone else follows. You know what the baseline is, and so you can play off of that. So yeah, we've split that apart, and I couldn't be happier with the way it turned out. It's been working great.
If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and all of that jazz. It really helps a lot. But also, please check out The Cultists, the web series on this channel about modern-day D&D playing Lovecraftian cultists who just want to worship Cthulhu in a world full of people who just don't understand. Season 1 is on the channel now. But also, please check out my YouTube channel. I have over 150 videos on tabletop games and the fantasy genre. If you've enjoyed this video, you might enjoy many of them as well. I look forward to seeing you for them and many more videos to come.